it's like, and this goes with any type of solidarity work, it's about continuing to make yourself uncomfortable.
Yeah.
That's what work is about, right? You're uncomfortable because you're unpacking things that are wrong. Like, you shouldn't only feel uncomfortable about Indigenous children being in unmarked graves on September 30th. You should be uncomfortable on like, October
Oh,
1st, October 2nd. You should be uncomfortable on December 1st. Like, because Indigenous people are uncomfortable with that every single
every
day.
day.
Hi, y'all. I'm Shanice, and in today's video, I'll be talking to Maggie about the intersectionality between Indigenous and Black folks in Canada. You are watching Fi Di Kulcha on CharisMaggietv.
What up, everyone? CharisMaggie here. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to another episode of Fi Di Kulcha. I am really excited for this episode because it's been a long time I wanted to do this episode because, y'all, as someone who's living in Canada, I think that we need to be learning more about Indigenous culture and how we can be better allies. And so I'm super excited to have with me Shanice. Girl child, thank you so much for being here. So we have a history. I actually met Shanice back in, I think it was 2017 or 2016. There was a conference that we had in Toronto. It was the Rise Collision. And I
Mhm.
met her. So it was for Indigenous and people who were Black folks that we came together for a conference to, talk about issues, ways that we want to tackle it, and bring those tools back on campus to see how we can implement them. And she has just been someone who's very open and willing to share for anyone who wants to learn, especially about Indigenous culture. So I'm going to shut up and have Shanice introduce herself. Let us know who you are. And also, I want to know more about the background so everyone knows who you are.
Absolutely. So I'm going to introduce myself in the language first. So anin bojo boju shnis indishnakas and dobo to go nishnabemnang jajakendodem. Meiti makade nishnabekwe, Toronto Dunjiba, Dimensiona Nakuya Mississauga. So hello, my name is Shanese Steele. I am Afro-Indigenous. So my dad hails from Trinidad and Carriacou, Grenada. He's of Afro-Caribbean descent. And then my mom is Métis and Anishinaabe from what we now call Canada. And I've been doing equity work for 13 years now. Every time I say that, I'm like, damn, it's been a long time that
Yeah.
I've been doing this. But I also always say that like racialized and Indigenous folks are like activists their whole lives. Like the first time you usually have to advocate for yourself is as a child. And so, yeah, I feel like I've kind of been doing activism my whole life. That being said, a lot of my work has been in the education sector. So I started within the Toronto District School Board and then, of course, moved to post secondary and did a lot of work with the Canadian Federation of Students. And then I realized while I was in school that it felt a lot like I was like theorizing around the issues of my community while my community was struggling through things. And so I
Mm.
made the decision to drop out of school. And I'm not encouraging this for everybody. Like, stay in school, don't stay in school, do what works for you. But it was actually a conversation that I had with an Indigenous person from New Zealand, a Maori person. And they were talking about the fact that they had dropped out of law school. And I was like, oh my gosh, like that's law school, And
Yeah.
was like, she wanted to learn how to navigate the stars with her elders. And she was like, school will always be there, my elders won't. And so that was kind of like my push because I was like, I want to be doing community work now. And it's not to say that education isn't community work, because I absolutely believe that it is, right? But I needed to be on the ground. I needed to be in community in a way that I didn't feel like I could where I was going to school. And so yeah, I dropped out. I started doing my own consulting, and I just wanted to create an opportunity to make education more accessible for folks. So I started a nonprofit called the Ashkenong Project, and it's really about bridging conversations between Black, racialized, and Indigenous folks. Because when we talk about reconciliation in Canada, it's very geared towards white folks to settlers, people of European descent. And so racialized folks, Black folks, somehow just like disappear in this conversation. And so, yeah, that's kind of what my work is about, is educating, sharing information with folks that they might not have access to, and like starting conversations that aren't always started.
Wow, I love it. Listen, y'all are in for a treat, okay? That's all I can say. And I really like that you mentioned when the conversation of truth and reconciliation comes up that it's usually centered around white folks because yeah, I that's how I've felt when I've, heard conversations come up. So, I am very excited for this episode and I know people are going to learn a lot. So, let's get into it. Now, we have a lot of newcomers who come to Canada, and I am one of those persons that when I came to Canada, I did not know anything about Indigenous people, that Canada had Indigenous people. I always saw Canada as a quote unquote white country because that's what I saw, right? So, for someone who is, coming to Canada and wants to know more about recognizing the different groups of Indigenous people, are you able to like give us bite-sized way what are the different Indigenous groups that we can find in Canada?
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's three recognized groups of Indigenous people in Canada. So the first is First Nations. Now, it's important to understand that they're not a monolith or they're not all the same. In the same way that when you go to the Caribbean, we're not all the same in the Caribbean, right? We have our own distinct cultures, languages, customs, traditions, all of those things. So there are First Nation folks across Canada from the East Coast to the West Coast. And it's really important that when you're trying to learn about the communities that you're going to be in relationship with, in particular in First Nation with First Nation folks, that you learn which nation you are in relationship with. So, for instance, I'm in Toronto right now, or what folks call Toronto, and the traditional caretakers of these lands are the Anishinaabe Mississauga people and the Haudenosaunee people, right? And so it's important that you learn that you're learning the names of those nations and the names of those people, right? Caribbean folks, we always say we don't want to be called Caribbeans. What's Caribbeans, right? You're from individual places. So it's in the same way, understanding that, right? You then have Métis, and so this is where folks get really confused. So Métis, if you speak French, right, you're like, oh, mixed. It just simply means mixed, and no, in Canada, that's a very particular term. And so
Mm.
Métis refers to people who are the descendants of folks who were mixed, either French and Scottish, and a First Nation. And that First Nation can be Anishinaabe, it can be or Ojibwe, right? It can be Cree, it can be Dene. The Métis homelands are mostly northern Ontario and then into Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. And then there's some folks up in BC, but the homelands are really in that region. Métis people are distinct people, and so they have their own culture and customs that are distinct from First Nation folks, that are distinct from white settlers, right? They went through what we call ethnogenesis, and that refers
Okay.
to and the Caribbean went through ethnogenesis too, right? And the what that
Mm.
means is that a community was created before a place was like colonized or fully established. And right, we know colonization happened on these lands, but before Canada became an official country. So in order to be Métis, your family had to have acknowledged that they were Métis before 1850, and that's very specific, right? Because 1850 is kind of where we see really the establishment of Canada as like a colonial nation. And so
Mm.
folks from that community, you'll see I'm Métis, so you'll see us wearing sashes across our chest or around our waist. They're usually red and have blue and yellow and green and white in it.
Yeah.
And so those are Métis people, and they speak Michif. And that Michif is different. The dialect is different depending on the region. And then you have Inuit. And so Inuit are folks that you're going to find in your northern regions. So you're going to find them in Nunavut. You're going to find them in the Yukon, in Northwest Territories a bit. You're going to find them in northern Labrador and Newfoundland, right? So
Mm.
Inuit are all throughout the Arctic. Their homelands also reach into what is now Alaska and Greenland. So it's really important to acknowledge that the Inuit homelands span outside of Canada in the same way that actually First Nation homelands span outside of Canada, right? The border really ran between a lot of like nations and communities. But yeah, Inuit are northern folks. And fun fact, one person of Inuit descent is referred to as Inuk. So one person, Inuk,
Ah,
Inuit refers to the people. And when you say Inuit people, you're saying people. Inuit literally
people.
means, yeah, so yeah, you don't have to say Inuit people. You can just say Inuit, right? But they're in the Arctic regions. Their homelands are referred to as Inuit Nunangut. So they are particularly in the north, right? So, but yeah, when there are large populations of Inuit in places like Ottawa and Edmonton. But that's more based on like access and location. So those
Good.
are your Indigenous peoples of Canada. And again, there's diversity within those communities, right? And it's really about building relationships with the people in your area, because who you meet in Ontario is not necessarily going to be who you would meet in BC or who you would meet in Nova Scotia, right? It's very different.
Yeah. Wow. I really feel like I got a really good crash course and you had a lot of gems dropped in there. So at this point, anyone watching this video, you have zero excuse to not know like the differences because you got like a very clear, concise description. So thank you for that. So with our topic being the intersection between the Black community and Indigenous folks, and with your experience with that, I would like for you to share your perspective of the shared experience that both groups have had from your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what's really important to acknowledge is that Black folks are Indigenous folks. They're just not Indigenous to these lands. So when we talk about indigeneity, right, it's very to very specific places. So North America, New Zealand, Australia, again, places where the British colonized in a very particular way, right? And then everywhere else, Indigenous people were just like wiped out, right? So the Caribbean, there's just no Indigenous people left, right? According to white society and settler society, and then also the way in which we talk about the Caribbean. And then when you're looking at places like Africa, right, the continent of Africa, there is a differentiation between Indigenous and Black, right? Because when you think of the slave trade, that was very specific, right? And so this idea of allowing Black people to be intersectional people, that means that they have layers, and that means they're more than just the cattle that people saw us as, right? As animals or people to exploit for work and labor. And so when you start to add dimensions to a people, then you have to recognize them as people. So there's a very intentional way as to why we don't assign indigeneity to Black folks. Also, this like idea of like displacement from land, right? There's this
Mhm.
idea that like Africa's still Africa, no one was displaced, right? There's so indigeneity is talked about differently because it's like they still have their land. There's no need to differentiate them from anybody else. So again, it's very intentional in the way in which we talk about it. But when it comes into the context of Canada, right, it's important to understand when you're looking at the slave trade in Canada, and again, it's important to acknowledge that we had slavery here, despite what people like to say. Um,
Mhm.
the slave population was about 50% indigenous to these lands and African people who were enslaved, right? So, unlike the United States, there was a larger population of like integration and mixing within folks who were enslaved, right? And so it's important to acknowledge like that's where that history starts in Canada. There was already that um connection through this oppression, right? And so it starts there. It also starts when you think about when we talk about the first Black person to arrive in Canada, which like everyone loves talking about. Okay, the first Black person to arrive in Canada was like this free Black man, when actually no, he wasn't. He was a Black man who had been actually arrested and was in prison, and his prison sentence was bought, and he became an indentured servant on one of Samuel de Champlain's boats, right? Matthew de Costa
Oh.
was his name. And so it's important that you have to acknowledge that history, right? Canada really loves to like, I don't know if whitewash is the word really for it. They love to like kumbaya their stories
Mhm.
of like how this place came to be. And so yeah, and so when he arrived, he was a translator for Mi'kmaq and French folks, right? Like he was an interpreter. And so
Oh.
you have to ask yourself, how did he obtain the ability to be an interpreter for a language that he was like of a people he was not of? Right. And so
Yeah.
that in its very self, because we don't explore that story, but that in its very self tells the story of a solidarity between a Black man who was forcibly put onto this boat, brought to Canada, and began to build relationships with people who were meeting folks who wanted to do the same thing to him, to them. Right. And so this relationship builds where he's able to be an interpreter, where he's able to build relationships in Mi'kmaq territory on the East Coast, right, with Mi'kmaq people. And so that's really your really and truly your first story of Black and Indigenous relationship building on these lands. Then you get into the slave trade, and that's kind of your second story, right? But
Mhm.
this relationship that has happened, right? Understanding that Black folks, people of African descent, have been in what we now call Canada for over 400 years. So this idea that like they just never built relationships, they just never interacted with each other, they just never, it's a fallacy, right? It's untrue.
Yeah.
Of course, relationships were building, right? And so when you start to look at the disparities, when you start to look at how oppression plays out on Black and Indigenous people on these lands, so an overrepresentation in the foster care system, an overrepresentation in the prison system, being over policed, right? A lack of access to adequate education, a lack of access to adequate healthcare. These are all things that Black and Indigenous people are dealing with on these lands. And it might look different depending on where you are, right? So again, there's this assumption that Black folks have access to more things because they're mostly in urban settings, right? Most Black folks in Canada live in cities like Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. Of course, there's
Yeah.
Black folks everywhere in this country. You can go to Nunavut and find Black folks, right? But understanding
Yeah.
the majority of us are in large population places. So there's this assumption that we have more access to resources because we're in urban settings, right? But the reality is that what comes with that is discrimination. What comes with that is lower income neighborhoods. What comes with that is underserved communities. And so Black folks are dealing in urban settings with a lot of similar things that Indigenous folks are dealing with in rural settings, right? On reserves in their communities. And then also dealing with when they come to cities, right? So it's like a lot of the things that Black and Indigenous people are dealing with on their own in their silos are actually not really silos, right? They are interconnected. They are struggles that we both deal with. It's just we've been conditioned to think of them as completely separate, right? And I think when you think about that, why that's done, right? You need to also think of the history of Canada, and this goes back to Métis people. When you think about the Northwestern resistance that happened in the 1800s in places like Manitoba and Saskatchewan, right? Where Métis and First Nation folks came together, rebelled, which is why you have the RCMP. The RCMP was literally created to like quell this rebellion, to kill Indigenous people. That was the basis of the RCMP, right? So when you understand that history of Canada already has a history of recognizing two communities coming together to combat oppression and saying, we're not going to allow that. Why would you then allow
Yeah.
Black Indigenous people to see a solidarity with each other? You just wouldn't allow that to happen.
Wow. Yo, I'm like mind blown right now because what you're talking about, literally, I don't think a lot of us even realize that even today we're still seeing that with other underrepresented or other underserved groups in the form of like, immigrants who are coming from other places, whether it's as a refugee or, whatever other way they come to Canada. And I feel like even though Canada is known to be a place for its diversity and whatever, there is so much riffraff between us because all of us are like fighting for the same things, whether it's jobs, access to wealth, access, all these things. And it kind of, instead of having us come together and realize that we are not each other enemy for what is happening to us, it allows people to, now we have groups that have been underrepresented finding ways to, I would say, low-key oppress each other,
Well,
like
it's the crab in the bucket mentality, right? And I
that.
don't know if you said it. I heard this like years ago, probably like when I was still in school, but someone had said, people talk about how Black folks, racialized folks, Indigenous folks, we act like crabs in a bucket, right? But what they had said is that people forget that crabs aren't meant to be in buckets.
In buckets,
And
exactly.
when they said that, I was like, but it's true, right? It's like we have turned on each other because we've been put in these parameters that makes it appear that we have to fight each other, right? Because there's this idea that there's limited resources. We're always told that there's limited resources, limited funding, limited access, right? It's that word limited is always at the beginning of
Hmm.
things. And like, of course, things are not like infinite, right? Like we understand that like resources in like when we think of the land, right? The land is, I mean, the land will outlast us, but the point is it'll
Hmm.
get pushed to a point where we are not infinite, right? But
Yeah.
I think when what's in particular about like folks who have power saying this is limited, why is it always limited for people who don't have power? Because I don't see any limitation for folks without power, right? And so it's like you have all the money to bail out large corporations, right? When we had the crisis during the pandemic with the airlines, like it was like hundreds of millions of dollars to bail out airlines. And I was like,
Yep.
we have people who can't afford to live somewhere. We have houseless folks. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, so you have hundreds of millions of dollars to bail out corporations, but you don't have the money to put that into the infrastructure for housing, right? And so
Yep.
it's very interesting how everything's always limited when it comes to racialized, indigenous, lower income folks, queer folks, right? It's just never limited for folks with power.
Power. Yep.
Mhm.
Wow. Let me get back my train of thought. So segueing into what we talk about, you mentioned land, land
Mhm.
of course will reach its limit in terms of how we treat the land. A lot of conversation recently, or not even recently, it's just recently for some people who have been giving it some attention, the conversation of land back. When we
Mhm.
say land back, what does that mean in your perspective? I know everyone probably has their own idea of what land back means for them, but for you, what would you say land back means?
Yeah, so I think land back it's such an interesting conversation because yeah, it's very different for different people, right? So some folks are like land back doesn't mean that everyone has to leave, and some folks are like yeah, everyone has to leave. Like it's very dependent on the
Who you
person, right?
talk to?
Yeah, and so like it's interesting for me. I'm like yeah, when I think of land back, it looks like white folks leaving. Like it looks like them leaving, like 100%. It looks like them leaving the Caribbean. It looks like them leaving Africa. It looks like them
Ah,
leaving everywhere that they were not supposed to be. And I'm saying this as someone who has white ancestry. Like I'm very much someone who's like I would be okay with not existing if it meant that slavery didn't happen, if it meant that colonization didn't happen. Like I'm very much okay with that. When folks are like, "Well, you wouldn't exist." Okay? I
yeah,
currently wouldn't be dealing with the struggles that I'm dealing with as a racialized person. That sounds lovely, right? Like,
amazing.
right? So it's like for me, I'm like, yeah, that like when I think of land back, that's what I think of, right? For me, it gets more complex when we start talking about Black and racialized folks, right? And the way that
Yeah,
we've been forced to disperse from our homelands, right? And our connection to the land. And so I was having a conversation with my friend Layla. I think you met Layla at CFS, maybe. Yeah. So I was having a
yeah.
conversation with Layla, and she was saying, or they were saying, sorry, that when you talk about land back, like what are Black folks supposed to do? Are we supposed to dig our ancestors up out of the ground and bring them back with us? Like what does that mean
Mm,
for Black folks who have a different connection to these lands, right? And it's not to say that the connection is the same as indigenous people on these lands, because it's not, right? But understanding the way in which Black folks have had to work these lands, had to give their blood to these lands, have had to care for these lands, right? When you think about the way like Black folks were doing ceremony on these
mm.
lands. And I always in particular think about, and this is more of a United States context, but the Gullah Geechee community in the United States. Um,
Yep.
and they talk about like during the Civil War, the United States Civil War, that Gullah Geechee people were going and doing ceremony to bury people into the land to heal the land. And so it's like, how do you tell those folks that they have to leave? Right? Like
Mm,
what does that look like? So for me, I think outside of the context of like white folks go back, what does it mean, right? To return the land to its original caretakers, right? And I think for
mm,
me, that's what it looks like. It looks like indigenous folks taking back like caretaking responsibilities of the land. It looks like I always think about what would it have looked like if these lands weren't colonized, right? What Toronto was a meeting place for so many nations. What kind of bustling, like I think it still would be what Toronto is today, right? This like bustling,
yeah,
fast paced, everyone's coming in, connecting. You have people from so many different nations here. That's what it was prior to colonization. So I don't think that would have changed. But what would it have
yeah.
looked like? What would the land look like? Would we
Mm-hmm.
have skyscrapers the way that we do? Would we have pollution in Lake Ontario like we do? Like what would it look like? And so for me, it looks like returning back to that. But the reality is you can't send everybody home, right? That's a reality. That is an absolute reality. So again, it goes back to that returning caretaking responsibilities to indigenous peoples. It looks like giving them autonomy over the lands that they have, right? That they are caretakers of. like reservation land, the land in their treaties, like that's what it looks like, right? Moving back to conversations around what are our relationships to treaties? How do we honor that? How
Mm,
do we honor that relationship to the land that Indigenous people have through their treaties, right? So again, it kind of looks like that for me, but it looks different for everybody, and I think it's complex. I think it's hard. I
yeah.
think for some folks, right, the presence of others on your land feels violent, right? It,
Mm-hmm.
it feels violent. And so it's like, who am I to tell them when they say, I want everyone to leave? Who am I to tell you that's not valid? Right? Even
Mm-hmm.
even if you mean literally everybody, right? Like I can't sit here and tell you that that's wrong, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
you can't live on your land in the way that you should be because of the presence of others. So yeah, it's
Wow.
complicated.
It's complicated. So I guess the conversation is then when we're talking about giving that autonomy back to the caretakers of the land is how can others also work as stewards to help with that, like when we're having conversations about climate change and all, like how are you doing your part also, um not only as an individual but how are we standing up against corporations that usually do most of the issues that we have with climate change right now. So yeah, I think that is a conversation of actually listening to what is being said, and instead
Mhm.
of being offended, understanding where it's coming from and what the solutions could be. Because obviously, like, as you said, like everyone can't go, because for some of us, where is home? Like, where would they go
Mhm.
back to? Especially when you're talking about people who have history or ancestry where their ancestors were actually brought to Canada. Some of us are here as immigrants that we came from a Caribbean country or an African country or wherever, but then you're others that their ancestry is from their ancestors were enslaved on this land. So yeah, definitely a complex topic, but it would be good to see what proper conversations would look like to actually get to some sort of solution that people feel heard for sure. So, language and cultural preservation. This is something that I feel like is very vital both in the conversation in Indigenous communities and also that for Black folks. So, I guess my question to you is what are some collaborative or initiatives that aim to preserve and revitalize these languages that you have seen between these two communities, if you've seen any of that happening?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. I think it's still very much in silos in that, like, I will
Mm,
support you in your revitalization, you support me in my revitalization, but like that interconnection is not necessarily happening within the context of Canada in that way. I think it's very important to acknowledge that. I think like yeah, there's this interesting intersection that like those of us who are Afro-Indigenous stand at. And when I use the term Afro-Indigenous, right? Again, going back to the fact that I believe Black folks are Indigenous people. A lot of us are
mhm.
just Indigenous people who were displaced through things like slavery. But like as an Afro-Indigenous person, so a person who's mixed with Black and then Indigenous to these lands, it puts us at this interesting intersection of trying to figure out how to weave the two together in what you're saying in this like revitalization of understanding who you are and your connection to who you are. And it's hard. Like it's very
Yeah.
hard to figure out who you're honoring. Like my good friend Carrington Christmas, who's also Afro-Indigenous and intergenerationally Afro-Indigenous, which is a whole other story, whole other conversation. But she had talked about how an elder had said to her, like, which grandmother are you going to dishonor today? Like which one are you going to choose to like put away so that you can respect the other one, right? This like idea that when you live at an intersection like that, you can't honor both. And I went through
Mm,
a similar experience. I was someone who's like really heavy in ceremony, like in Anishinaabe ceremony specifically, and I was like really feeling this pull to connect to like Caribbean spirituality, And I'm gonna say a word that's very scary for a lot of Caribbean people, obia, right? This again, like
mm,
obia, voodoo, this idea that they are evil, like demonic things that are based, right? And understanding that like that is not true. Christianity came through and like we changed the way that we talk about it. But it's very interesting, like in particular in Carriacou, where my dad's family's, I would say originally from, but like after the slave ship, but where they're from, right, before they immigrated to Trinidad, is we have like a lot of these customs and traditions that are based in African spirituality. And so like on November 1st, we call it All Saints Day, you go to the grave and you put out food and water and alcohol for your ancestors, and you sit and you tell
Mm.
stories and you talk, right? Like there's, New Year's Eve, you cook black eyed peas because you're bringing in the new year in a particular way. Like there's certain things which also Black Americans do. I didn't know they also cook black eyed peas for New Year's.
Yeah.
But right, there's these traditions in the Caribbean that are based in African spirituality that I think we've forgotten that, or we've like changed the language around it because of words like obia and voodoo feel so scary. So it's like you're not
Mm.
going to call it that, right? You're not, like if you have a grandmother that technically does root work, oh, my grandma, she just likes her teas, she just makes her, like you're
Yeah.
gonna word it in a way
Find a
that doesn't,
different way.
yeah, right? And so I was getting this pull to it, like this pull to think more about my spirituality as an Afro-Caribbean person. And there's like an element of using, again, alcohol and tobacco. And for
Mm.
Anishinaabe people, you do not mix alcohol with sacred medicines, and tobacco is a sacred medicine. And I remember feeling so conflicted. Like I felt like I couldn't honor my dad's side of the family because it was going to disrespect my mom's side. And like I'd sat down with an elder and I just like, I don't know what to do. I was having such a hard time. And she just looked at me and she said, does it feel like, put your that other stuff aside, right? Like what's in your mind, put that aside. She said, in here, does it feel good? And I said, yeah. And she said, that's all that matters. And then she said the simplest thing. She was just like, just keep your bundles separate. You have two sets of tobacco, one
Mm.
for this, one for, and it was such like a simple way to look at it, but she was just like, why are you trying to figure out how to divide yourself when this is who you are in your entirety? Right? And so
Yeah.
for a lot of Afro-Indigenous folks, we kind of struggle with how do we meld the two in a way that honors both, right? How do we walk both roads? How do we, like, it's kind of having your foot kind of in two boats, and like
Yeah.
one's going faster than the other, and the goal is to have both boats going at the same pace at the
Same
same time,
time.
right? And that goes for anybody who's living at an intersectionality. If you're Black and queer, right? If you're Black and
Mm.
francophone, like you're trying to find that like simplicity of just going along in life. I think on the larger scale, more people are starting to have conversations about what Afro-Indigeneity is and what that
Yeah.
can look like, right? And what that like connection of cultures and language looks like. I think how people are honoring each other in that is like using like correct names for people's nations, right? It's learning the place names for places in that language. It's being respectful. It's not, again, not referring to Africa as a country, not referring to the Caribbean as one place. It's like that
Yeah.
taking the time to learn those nuances within community is how like we're doing that kind of individually. But I think together, those conversations are starting to happen. But I don't think folks know just yet what that looks like.
Looks like. For
Mm-hmm.
sure. Yeah, I get that. Hopefully it gets to some point that, because I feel like it's a struggle to kind of figure out, apart from like, folks that I know like yourself, sometimes I kind of feel weird to like ask questions, or I don't know what
Mm-hmm.
questions to ask because I don't want to ask the wrong thing. So it's like all of these nuances to kind of navigate, but it's good to know that there is space to have these conversations as well. For
Yeah,
sure.
100%. There's definitely the space to have it, right? And I think what I tell
Yeah,
everybody is don't be afraid to ask. First, make sure folks have capacity. That's always my thing. Like, hey, do you have the
true.
capacity to share this with me? Or like if you don't have money to pay people, how can I reciprocate, sorry, the knowledge that you're sharing with me, right? So it's like
Facts.
you can have these conversations. And I think it's just like really as like a racialized person, right? As a Black person, as a person who's a refugee or immigrant or a migrant worker, like what questions would you be okay with being asked? Right? Like if you wouldn't be okay with being asked something, don't then ask that of another people, right? Like if you as
Mhm.
a for me, I'm a Trinidadian person. If someone comes and asks me something about Jamaica, now that being said, I actually know quite a lot about Jamaica, but I'm not Jamaican. So if you came and asked me something that was very particular to Jamaica, I would be like, why are you asking me this? I'm Trini. Right. So like why would you
Mhm.
go to somebody who's like Ojibwe and be like, oh, I heard folks in like Nunavut were doing this. Like, do Anishinaabe use dogs and sleds as well? Why are you asking a person who's not from that region if they use it, right? So it's really about what would you be comfortable being asked to then ask that to somebody else.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, definitely a good lesson there. Wow. So September 30th, which is when this video is going to be dropping, is the day of truth and reconciliation. We hear about it every single year. However, I don't know if the things that are put in place to actually put aside time to recognize it are just lip service or if it's actually moving the needle. As someone who has a background as, you have indigenous ancestry as well, what would you say are ways that settlers on the land, immigrants, etc., can actually be better allies to the indigenous community in not recognizing just this day, but like beyond this day, actually giving a crap? You know what I mean? Like, how can they go about doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think again, it goes back first to like what I always tell people before you interact with the community, you have to unpack yourself first. So, like, what
Mhm.
is your relationship to the land? What is your relationship to the community that you want to engage with? What is your community's relationship to this community, right? It's like you need to unpack your positionality because if you just go into things and you don't know where you stand as a person, you're always going to bump up against something, right? So it's really like unpacking what your relationship and your positionality is. Then it's like asking yourself why you want to do this. So, like, do you want to support indigenous people just because it's a trend? Then you're not going to do it in a genuine way, right? Do you want to
Mhm.
interact with indigenous people because you feel guilty? Again, not a good place to
Not
start from. if
genuine.
you if you have guilt, that's fine. Work through it and then engage. Don't engage because you feel guilty, because then you're going to start to get into this like savior complex, and nobody needs that, right? So it's really about like, what are your intentions? Why do you want to work with community? Next is definitely educating yourself. There's so many resources online. Use
Oh my God.
Google, like you can go into Facebook and type in like, what does this mean to, like, you can do that research before speaking to folks. So again, like, read as much as you can, watch as much as you can. There's so many amazing TED Talks and TED Eds and all of that on YouTube, right? Like, that free access to education,
Mhm.
utilize it, right? Learn. I think next is then taking the steps to interact with the community that you want to interact with. And depending on your city, there's friendship centers that are there. Like, right, those hard questions that you want to ask, that how do I get involved? How do go to your local friendship center? Like,
Mm.
your native friendship center, go to the local one, say, hey, I'm an ally, I really would like to support. Do you have resources where I could learn? Are there like volunteer opportunities where I can like gift my labor? Like, how can I support? Right, that is how you do that work. If you live next to a reserve, call the band office. Hey, do you have any volunteer positions? If a powwow is coming up, go to the powwow. I know a lot of folks are like afraid to show up at powwows, and of course, like, don't show up if you're going to stand there and look at indigenous people like zoo animals. Like, that's not, in the same way, like at Caravana, I don't want folks looking at me like I am a zoo
Yes.
animal. But
Yes.
if you're going there to learn and engage and put your money into indigenous community, right? Like, spend money while you're there, absolutely go, right? Like, there's so many opportunities to like support. Look up, like, again, friendship centers have a list of all of their events. If there's a local
Mhm.
market, if there's a local event, right? That's how you go out and engage and get involved. And that's really like having an opportunity to build relationships. Because when we talk about reconciliation, like, again, the reason why it's so centered around like white settlers, is because those are the folks that took the land, regardless of whether or not your ancestors themselves took the land. You come from nations that benefited from that
From
land being
that.
taken, right? Like, I hear
Yeah.
a lot like Eastern Europeans are like, we were in the slave trade, but you were definitely a part of like settling or being settlers in Canada, right? You might not have been
Mhm.
the original folks to settle Canada. That, right? We can understand that was the French and British, but to act like the Ukrainian population didn't increasingly take up space within the prairies. And again, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but to like not acknowledge that history of Eastern Europeans definitely taking up settler aspects on these lands is wild. So you have to acknowledge that you come from places, right, that benefit that. So that's the reason why reconciliation often talks about that, because that's what needs to be reconciled, right? But
Mhm.
we don't talk about like, what is the relationship building in that. It's past just saying I'm sorry. right? It's past just like
Mm-hmm.
donating money. Like, how are you building actual real relationships with Indigenous people? And so for me, like after September 30th, it looks like taking the time to continue to build those relationships, but also taking the time to continue to be uncomfortable, right? A lot of people get uncomfortable with September 30th because you're being like, it's being thrown in your face, things that Indigenous people have been dealing with for hundreds of years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Residential schools existed for a very long time. And prior to that, Indigenous children were still being taken. And after residential schools, children were still being taken,
It's been
right?
taken. Yep.
There are more children, Indigenous children, in the foster care system now than there was at the height of residential schools. So understanding that
Mm-hmm.
that is still continuing, right? Taking the time to continue to make yourself uncomfortable by that situation. Like, you shouldn't only feel uncomfortable about Indigenous children being in unmarked graves on September 30th. You should be uncomfortable on like, October
Oh,
1st, October 2nd. You should be uncomfortable on December 1st. Like, because Indigenous people are uncomfortable with that every single
every
day,
day.
right? So
Yeah.
for me, it's like, and this goes with any type of solidarity work, it's about continuing to make yourself uncomfortable.
Yeah.
That's what the work is about, right? You're uncomfortable because you're unpacking things that are wrong. So I think a lot of folks have become desensitized. And so it's like, you're crying on
Yeah.
September 31st, but October 1st, right? The orange shirts get thrown off. And here you are continuing to disrespect Indigenous people, continuing to like not even know how to pronounce our names. The amount of people that I've heard who think land acknowledgements are the end all be all of reconciliation, one, can't even pronounce the name of the nations that they're trying to honor. And then two, that's another thing. Like, this is the last thing I'll say on this. When it comes to land acknowledgements, because again, a lot of folks think that's the end all be all of it. Even as racialized people, right? Like, I'm acknowledging this land doesn't belong to me. It's past that. Like, what does that mean to you? Right?
Mm-hmm.
When you're a person who's an immigrant, right? Or let's say a refugee, like you are a person who's a refugee. What does it mean to you to have found safety on lands of people who will never be able to go to another country and find refuge? Because Indigenous people in Canada
Mm-hmm.
can't go to Germany and say, I'm a refugee as an Indigenous person because of the violence that I face in Canada as an Indigenous person. Because what Germany's going to say to you is, Canada's a first world country. What are you talking about? You don't face any persecution there. Right? So
Mm-hmm.
Indigenous people on these lands don't have the opportunity to seek refuge somewhere else. And so, as a
Yeah.
refugee, what does that mean for you? What does that mean to seek refuge on lands where those people will never be able to go to find somewhere to find refuge? Right? Talk about that. Talk about what that means to
Yeah.
come as an immigrant. Talk about what it means to come to these lands and not even know that the original people of these lands existed. What does that mean for you to then take up that space? Right? So again, like when you're doing land acknowledgements, this is my biggest issue with land acknowledgements is organizations, people, they read a generic one and they keep it pushing. But what does it actually mean? If you want to start with
Mean.
reconciliation, what does it mean to you to be on these lands in relationship to Indigenous people? Not, oh, I'm so happy as an immigrant that I came to Canada and I have all these access to jobs and resources and da 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 da. Right? That's not that is how you feel about your relationship to Canada, to the
Canada.
government. That's not what your relationship to these lands are.
And
And so
sorry.
I think that's the differentiation that people need to make.
Wow. I told y'all at the beginning of this video that you were going to definitely learn a lot. And these are the uncomfortable conversations that you all know me for this. I have these on my channel to, push the needle to talk about these things because if no one else wants to do it, why not? And so before I let you go, I want you to let the people know where they can find you to not only support your work, but also if they would like to hire you for, doing a workshop. As you can see, Shanice is a powerhouse. Let them know where they can find you.
Then you keep like complimenting me, and I'm like, you're out here doing the work. Like, you are, no, for real. Like, I am, before I get into where folks can find me, like, also, like, you deserve your flowers and the amount of information that you put out. And again, it goes back to like immigrant folks, as a child of an immigrant, like, are completely erased from this conversation of being educated. It is like simply like immigrants and refugees and migrants come to Canada and like are just seen as people to do labor. Like that's really what
Mhm.
we are seen as. We like and especially from the Caribbean, like I cannot stress this enough. We are still seen as people who are here to do labor, whether it's to take care of people's children, whether it's to be in nursing homes, whether it's to farm
The
lands, right?
farm. Yeah.
Yeah, there's no conversation about how do we, I don't even think educate is the word, but like invite Caribbean folks, immigrant folks, refugee folks, migrant folks into these conversations. We don't talk about that. And you're doing that work past this conversation of Indigenous people, but like on a larger scale. So just, yeah, just when we're talking about powerhouses, baby, what powerhouse. So I just had to say that before I got into my little spiel about where folks can find me. But yeah, so folks can find me on Instagram. You can either follow me at Learn with Shanese, which is where like my educational stuff is, or at Shanese Anne. That's more my personality. That's where I'm a little more vocal, right? Professional, personal. You got to keep it a little separate sometimes. And then folks, if they would like to book me, if they would like to inquire about my work, you can go to shaniceanne.ca. And you can email me through there, book me through there. But yeah, those are the places that you can find me. You can interact with me. If you message me on the gram, I might take a couple of days to respond. I do apologize for that. Life be busy, things be going on. But yeah, that's where folks can find me. And please don't hesitate to like reach out. Again, ask if I have capacity when you do though. But yeah, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm always down to like educate, have conversations, unpack things with folks. But yeah, that's where folks can find me. And again, thank you so much for having me on here.
No problem. And folks, all the information will be in the description box of this video, so you'll know exactly where to find Shanese. Thank you again so much for being here with me. To my audience, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in another episode. Bye.
Bye.
Did you enjoy that video? Well, you'll enjoy more videos like it by clicking over here. So tap to watch now.